Hi, my name is Ryan McEwen. I'm a professor here in the Department of Biology, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the exit seminar portion of the Master's Thesis Defense of Grace Attea. So a few programming notes. I'll give a brief introduction, and Grace will give a presentation that's going to be 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for questions from anybody in the audience. Then the audience will depart and the committee will stay after for the actual defense portion, which will be over partially over the presentation, but also over the thesis itself, which Grace has presented to a committee for review. After that, around 1:45, 2-ish maybe, there'll be a gathering right out here in the fishbowl. So yeah, if you're waiting around to hang out with Grace in celebration, presumably, just give us maybe 45 minutes or so after the presentation ends. Okay, so by way of introduction, the goal or primary goal of the McEwen Lab is to provide opportunities for students. Elevating or being a springboard for student careers is kind of why we're here, and it's what makes all the other stuff tolerable, I'll say. And it's been one of the most enjoyable experiences in my entire career to watch Grace's journey in science. So we first met in 2018, that's 5 years ago, in February. She sent an email to me. She was switching over from chemical engineering, was it? It was engineering anyway to environmental biology, and reached out with the email like, hey, I'd like to get involved in research. So she was involved in my research lab from then until now through all kinds of stuff, COVID and everything else. She's also been a student in my class many times, and I'll say, like, one of the first things I recognized about Grace was a really inspiring curiosity and enthusiasm. So she's expressed this in the lab in many cases, and also in the classroom. In 2018 fall, I believe it was, I was teaching a class called Environmental Instrumentation Lab, and we were outside sweating, and it was like restoration, like hands-on restoration. And a lot of students are sort of turned off by that, getting bug bit and scratched up and sweaty, and Grace wanted more, more and more, which was inspiring to me actually as a teacher. Then Grace began her work as a graduate student in my lab and began to express some other traits, including inclusiveness. And so I think Grace is among the most naturally inclusive people I've ever been around, to be honest. Every person she talks to feels elevated. Every team she's on is happy she's there. Every room she's in, we're happy she's in the room. And this is a rare and unique trait. I can say personally, I go in many rooms and people are sad. I'm about to go in one this afternoon. I just wish I wasn't there, but this is never true for Grace, which is a really wonderful thing. In my lab, we talk about vibe literally every day. Every day we talk about vibe. And Grace is a vibe superstar. During her master's degree, she's also began to express other traits, including a keen intellect. And actually, over the last, I will say, 13 or 14 months, there's been an acceleration in the program and in her science. It's been sort of breathtaking for me. And these traits, inclusiveness, curiosity, enthusiasm, which those three are all you need in life, combine that with intellect, so that's great. But then these things merged and became something more like scientific aspiration. That was really exciting to see. So you can imagine I'm really happy, very, very happy and proud of the work Grace has done and where she's gotten to on her journey, and excited to share that with you. And so help me welcome to the podium Grace Attea.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Dr. McEwen, for the introduction. Today, I'm going to be defending my thesis, and it is titled 4 Decades of Temporal and Spatial Dynamics in an Old-Growth Beech Maple Forest in Southwestern Ohio, USA. So you might be thinking to yourself, why is this research important, or why was this a worthwhile objective for a master's thesis? And I first want to frame the project in the context of old growth dominance at the global scale. So old growth forests are incredibly rare, and while they once encompassed the earth, units of these astoundingly complex ecosystems are now subtly woven into human-altered landscapes. There's about 36% of old growth left globally, most of this existing in places like the northern boreal forests in Siberia and in the Amazon in Brazil, and there's actually less than 6% in the United States. With the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in the United States in the early 19th century, the landscape started to experience a profoundly new level of anthropogenic impact. Settlements sprawled as the human population increased, and nearly all of the forests were cleared for agricultural purposes or for timber sales. So these older maps, the black represents old growth forests, and the gray represents all other land cover categories combined. You can see from 1620 to 1992, we lost about 90% of old growth forest. That number's even higher today. And by 1992, it was such a small fraction of the landscape that it was actually discontinued as a national land cover category. So old growth forests are very important to conserve because they are protective of large-scale ecosystem processes. This includes carbon sequestration, which we know is very important for mitigating global climate change. So the sequestered carbon is stored in the form of woody tissues, whether this is alive or dead, and slowly decomposing organic matter in the soil. So contrary to theories of carbon storage that were popular in the 1960s and 70s, recent research is showing that forests can actually continue to accumulate carbon as they age. So here we have 5 different age classes, A to E, that's young to old, and in 3 different forest types, boreal, temperate, and tropical. We can see on the y-axis, we have 2 measurements of carbon storage, living biomass, and total ecosystem. And the trend that we're seeing is that as all forests age, they're accumulating more and more carbon. So unfortunately, a lot of this carbon will be released back into the atmosphere if we continue to disturb these ecosystems. Another large-scale ecosystem process that is uniquely protected and enhanced by old growth forests is biodiversity. So this refers to the spectrum of morphological and genetic variability both within and among species, as well as the ecological complexities of their environments. And Dr. William Keaton at the University of Vermont did a lot of work on habitat complexity. And he talks a lot about how when we talk about biodiversity, we need to have habitat characteristics represented for all seral and successional stages in order to optimize the full array of biodiversity that's available within a landscape. So what this looks like in old growth forests is a unique assemblage of stand architecture. So we have things like snags, which are standing dead trees. These are really awesome because they have holes in them that cavity dwelling birds and bats can live in. We have tip-up mounds, which is when an entire tree falls over and it takes up the root system and it leaves a depression in the earth. And then when it rains, it fills up with water and it allows for a safe space for breeding of amphibians and reptiles away from the predation of fish. There's coarse woody debris, which is any decaying wood on the ground. This allows for the colonization of ferns and fungi and mosses and even creates gaps that mammals can live in. These forests have a low overall percentage of invasive species. So what we're seeing here is invasive garlic mustard that has completely taken over a forest understory. It reproduces and spreads really quickly, and it shades out the native species that we would usually see here that are a little bit more fragile in their reproductive capacities. At the landscape scale, these forests are also heterogeneous across space. So this means that they vary in topography, in soil pH, in soil moisture, the presence of streams, and this allows niche habitat space to be created within the landscape as well. So all of this put together, old growth forests are really good at hosting rare and endangered species. Another important aspect of old growth forests that do remain is that they serve as a model for understanding forest dynamics without the influence of humans. This idea allows us to create large strategic management plans to both conserve old growth and to hopefully create more in the future. So in the late 1980s, we saw the rise of both new forestry and ecological forestry. And you can see in this picture here, instead of harvesting the entire forest, they're harvesting it in patches. So they're mimicking the natural disturbance mechanism of the forest and allowing it to regenerate naturally. By the 1960s, both the government and the public noticed the detrimental effects of logging on both ecological and human communities, and legislation was put into place in order to protect these ecosystems. It started in the 1890s, but I want to highlight three that became really important in the 70s. That's the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Forest Management Act. These mandated the protection of species as well as their habitats. It required restoration, and it finally placed controls on harvesting of timber and other natural resources. So this study reconstructed historical land cover and biophysical parameters of the eastern United States. In 1850, if you can see down here, most of the map is covered by this 91 to 100 category, which is the dark green that represents old growth. By 1920, the landscape is mostly agrarian, with most of it being covered by the 0 to 10 categories. But fortunately, with the passing of these acts, by 1992, we see that again, this landscape is covered by the 91 to 100 category, but now this represents regrowing forest. So we did see a lot of success from this. So thinking about these forests regrowing, it's important to visit the idea of forest formation and succession. So succession is a process of forest development that unfolds over centuries, and over time, the plant community increases in both size and in complexity, ultimately resulting in a forest that is in a dynamic state of equilibrium. Once the steady state is reached, the forest needs to continue to endure. So that's when we get into disturbance mechanisms. These are any relatively discrete event in time that changes population dynamics, resource availability, or the physical environment. Disturbance looks really different depending on your geographic location. It can take lots of different forms, including fire, flooding, insects and pests that are native. But one that I want to focus more on today are called canopy gap dynamics. So canopy gaps are open spaces in a forest overstory due to the death of one or several trees. This can happen for lots of reasons: old age, or insect infestation, or wind. This causes an influx of nutrients and light into the understory, and light is the most limited resource for understory tree species, so they start to fight with each other to try to reach a place in this canopy. This is really important for these individuals because a spot in the canopy means dominance and longevity, and also the ability to reach reproductive capacity. So my favorite way to think about this, imagine you're looking at the forest from an aerial perspective. Say this tree dies in 1970, maybe this group in 1990, that one in 2000, and that one in 2012. All of the suppressed individuals existing in the forest layers beneath these will fight with each other sometimes for decades in order to secure that spot. And at the landscape scale, what we end up seeing is the habitat being represented by a mosaic of different aged patches, which is one of my favorite quotes. So now I want to bring together these three ideas of habitat complexity, succession, and disturbance. And so what we see on the left side here is the successional pathway with ecological energy being exerted, and that's reproduction and competition. And on the other side, we have canopy gap disturbances that are causing mortality and removing biomass from the system. So ultimately, what we end up with is the perpetuation of habitat complexity and biodiversity in these forests that are in a regional state of dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so now that we know some history about old growth, some function, and some developmental processes, it's important to think about how exactly we study these ecosystems. Scientists use what are known as permanent plot studies. This is research that unfolds over decades, and it's repeatedly measuring the same thing in the same exact way over a periodic and endless time frame. This is really useful for old growth forests because sometimes the trees, well, usually the trees, are longer lived than the researchers themselves. So it takes decades of consistent science and data collection to understand the ways in which they live in and interact with their environments. There are lots of benefits to permanent plots. We can highlight long-term trends and address how these change with global change drivers. And we can link these different trends across different regions and across the nation. There's also challenges to permanent plots, again, including species longevity and the development of dynamics over an extended timescale. as well as the effort to continue the legacy of a project after a researcher retires. Unfortunately, these systems, especially in the eastern United States, or I should say particularly because that's what we're going to be talking about, are under a great deal of anthropogenic stress. This takes many forms, from pollution to agricultural runoff and continued fragmentation and logging. But the two that I want to focus on today are invasive species and overpopulation, specifically of white-tailed deer. So there are many historically destructive invasive species in the eastern United States. These are non-native organisms that come into a region and cause both economic and environmental damage. I'm sure you recognize some of these. This is certainly not all of them, but the one that I want to focus on right now is the emerald ash borer. This was introduced to Detroit, Michigan in 2002, where that star is. And since then, it has spread to 36 states in the United States. It came over by accident on wooden shipping crates. It bored into the shipping crates and it just got here. And since then, it has caused a 99% mortality rate in all species in the genre Fraxinus, which are ash trees. It causes mortality by boring into the cambium of the wood, which is the growing layer, and it essentially cuts off the flow of nutrients and water in the tree. So this map displays ash species density and distribution, which you can see is extremely prevalent in the eastern United States. And actually, as of 2018, all 5 species of ash that exist here were listed as critically endangered. The loss of this group has negative effects on the forest's ability to store carbon in the form of living biomass, and it also causes the alteration of community dynamics and the successional pathway. So another anthropogenic stressor that I want to get into is the loss of keystone predators and its effects. So in this figure, we're seeing the percentage of large carnivores lost. Specifically in the eastern United States, since the time of European colonization, you can see we've lost between 75 and 100% of large carnivores or predators. In Ohio specifically, we've seen the extirpation of 3 different species in the 1800s: gray wolves, mountain lions, and black bears. And black bears actually started to make a comeback in the 1990s, which is great. But with the loss of this top-down regulation in these ecosystems, we're experiencing a substantial increase in the white-tailed deer population, which has extreme degenerative effects on the vegetative community. So white-tailed deer were actually endangered in Ohio in 1909. But since then, we've seen an exponential increase in the deer population, as you can see on the y-axis over time. So we've gone from about 1,000 individuals estimated in 1925 to 680,000 in 2021, which is wild. This has many human and ecological impacts, including the transmission of zoonotic diseases, a decrease in forestry and agricultural economies, as well as in native diversity due to that overbrowse, and an alteration of forest dynamics. In this figure, we can see 3 hypothetical relationships that have been proposed between plant abundance, which is on the y-axis, and browsing pressure, which is on the x-axis. In the top figure, we see that deer have a modest effect on plant abundance in response to this increasing browse pressure. In the second figure, we see that there's a point at which the plant abundance sharply declines. And in C, we see that browse has created a non-linear formation that is not simply reversible, where browse has extended beyond the capacity of the browse forage. So our study specifically takes place in the beech maple region in the eastern United States. This type of forest also exists in Europe as well as in Canada, which I think is really cool. It is a regional climax community, and what we're seeing here is a land cover map. So about 72% of this area has been altered by humans, about 17% remains forested, and here's where a study site is, and less than 1% is old growth. So we call it the beech maple region because it is this co-dominant existence of 2 different trees, American beech trees and sugar maple trees. And they exist in this co-dominant state because a balance of their reproductive capacities and their competitive physiologies. So sugar maple trees have a very high seed fall, so a very high reproductive capacity, They grow relatively quickly in light spaces, and they can survive for a relatively long period of time in shaded understories. American beech trees, on the other hand, have a lower seed fall. They make up for this by root sprouting, so they have an additional reproductive method. And they can survive for a longer period in the understory, but they don't grow as fast as sugar maple. The overarching goal of this study is to leverage 41 years of permanent plot data in order to assess forest dynamics in Hueston Woods Preserve. I should have switched that, that's okay. So our study site is within Hueston Woods Park. It's a historic homeland of the Kaskaskia, Osage, Shawandassi-Tula, Miamia, Adena, and Hopewell people who built productive societies for thousands of years before Europeans came over. It was bought by the state of Ohio in 1940, and by 1973, it was designated a nature preserve. So here is a map of the park itself. In the dark green, we have the preserve. You can see it butts right up to the human-made Acton Lake. And then the black star is our field site location, and we have a blowout of the plot. So I did want to mention that this project was actually started at Miami University by Dr. John Van Kat. He taught and researched plant ecology there for 31 years, and now he actually continues to do ecological research in Arizona, which is awesome. So the plot is 100 by 105 meters. There's 21 transects that run south to north, and 25 by 5 meter subplots in each transect. So for the sampling history, this is a long-term permanent plot. So it was established in 1979. It was sampled 4 times in 1981, 88, 94, and 2000 before being passed on to the McEwen lab where we did the 5th sampling. So for our methods, we went on into the field and we collected a whole bunch of data. We collected height data for all woody species over 1 meter. We collected DBH measurements, which is the diameter at breast height. We identified each individual down to the species level. And we hand mapped the location for each individual stem. For our spatial analysis methods, we had all these really cool historical maps. As you can see up there, that's us trying to relocate the plot. So we georeferenced and digitized all of these, and that's actually where all of our data came from, was all of these maps. We took this vector data, which is right here. We transformed it into raster data, which is basically a contiguous surface. And from that, we used point density and raster calculator methods in order to create stand density maps. And then we reclassified this into the finest categories we possibly could. So from this data, we were able to calculate importance values, which are composed of relative basal area, which if you think about looking at, say you cut a tree, we didn't actually cut the trees, but the surface area of that tree cookie. The frequency is the number of subplots that contain at least one individual living stem of each species, and density is the number of stems per species. Okay, for the results. So I split this into 3 different parts. First, we look at overarching forest dynamics for the overstory and the understory, so those broader trends. I then am going to break them up into importance values, so then taking the species in those 2 different layers and looking at those specifically. And then framing both of these things within the context of the anthropogenic stressors that we know exist in the region. So for our first prediction, we thought that importance values would vary between all sampling years due to the stochastic nature of late successional understories. And for the overstory, we predicted that importance values would remain relatively stable for the first 4 years, followed by extreme changes between 2000 and 2022. So this first figure shows basal area. We have the year on the x-axis and basal area on the y-axis in centimeters squared. Each year is a different sampling year, and then each dot represents an individual stem. What we're seeing here is that the cap sampling years, 1981 and 2022, are statistically different from each other. You can tell by the letters on top, A and C are different, and they're also different than all of the years in the middle. The 3 years in the middle, however, are statistically indistinguishable. I also wanted to point out the sample size. So we see a spike in sample size from 1981 to 1988, and then a decrease each year thereafter. For the overstory, looking at the same figure, we see that there's a stepwise increase in basal area, and we also see an overlap in significance between sampling years, again with the years that are the furthest apart being the most different. So what these two figures are telling us is that changes are happening over long periods of time. I also wanted to point out the sample size here. You can see it starts at 322 in 1981 and decreases each year after. So the last thing that's going to be important for interpreting the rest of the results, there's about 6 to 7 years between the first sampling years, and then between 2000 and 2022, there's 22 years. And so that's just something that we take into account when thinking about this. So next, looking at overall stand density, these maps are a combination of both the overstory and the understory for the entire plot for each sampling year. And the bright yellow represents high density and the dark blue represents low density. So high density is a lot of trees, low density is very few trees. We can see for the first 4 years, there are lots of high and low density patches, but by 2022, what we see is a relatively evening out of the stand, with more of the stand being represented by this middle category of density, moderate. So here we have raster data showing the change in overall stand density from 1981 to 2022. I thought this really represented this quote that we talked about earlier well, of the forest being represented by a mosaic of different aged patches. And what we're seeing here is that most of the plot experienced no change in density. There were more changes in the high category of density for decrease than there were in the low category for increase. Okay, so now splitting this apart into importance values, so per species. And first looking at the understory. So on the x-axis, we have all of the individual species, and on the y-axis, we have importance values. And then each of these stacked bars is composed of basal area, which is in red, density, which is in yellow, and frequency, which is in blue. And then the last thing you need to know is that these are faceted into each sampling year so we can compare all of the species from year to year. So what we're seeing is that for the first 4 sampling years, there is that fluctuation that we expected because there's a lot of competition and reproduction in late successional understories. But we do see that sugar maple, which is this first bar here, is having a stepwise increase. However, by 2022, we start to see really extreme shifts with increases in American beech, pawpaw, and spicebush, and decreases in sugar maple, black cherry, 100% mortality in ash, and decreases in the other species as well. For the overstory, again, we see relatively stable state for the first 4 years, and then changes in 2022, with an increase in sugar maple, black cherry, and tulip poplar, and a decrease in American beech and all of the other species, including 100% white ash mortality. So revisiting these predictions, importance values did vary between sampling years due to the stochastic nature of late successional understories. We did find that there was a relatively stable state for the first 4 sampling years, but we also had this idea of compounding anthropogenic stressors. So now what I want to do is place the previously discussed results into the context of anthropogenic disturbance to understand the drivers of ecosystem change. So first looking at the impacts of white-tailed deer herbivory on the understory specifically. So we tacked on a third prediction once we got into this, and that was that aggressive white-tailed deer browse would lead to a decrease in density and diversity. So what we did is we took all of the understory species and we split them up into groups based on their relative palatability to deer. So we have it from a spectrum of preferred group that deer really like to eat, and unpalatable species that deer are not known to eat. And this is actually a picture of a deer that we found right outside of our plot, which was cool. So I'm going to have a lot of these figures, so I just put a blank one up here to explain it to you before I dive in. So we have species names on the x-axis, 41-year change from 1981 to 2022 on the y-axis, and that's in values of basal area, which is in gray, and density, which is in blue. If the bar is going up, it's an increase. If it's going down, it's a decrease. And then I also included the sample size on here for each respective year. So n equals the number of stems. So first, for the preferred group, the trend that we're seeing is that all of these preferred species are decreasing in density. So all of the black bars are going down. We do see an increase in basal area for a few of these species. That could be because they are growing just enough to get out of the browse range, but not big enough to reach the overstory. So that's kind of what that looks like. We also see 100% mortality in all of these species outlined in red by 2022. For the moderately palatable species, we see the same trend where all of these are decreasing in density in the black, and bitternut hickory is increasing in basal area. And we see 100% mortality in 4 out of 5 of these species. For the not preferred species, we do see 100% mortality in hornbeam and Ohio buckeye. They were a little bit more opportunistic in 1981 and rare. You can see there was 4 and 2 individuals respectively. And these species, American beech and black cherry, you can see there are pretty extreme fluctuations going on, but it makes more sense to talk about this in the context of what's going on in the overstory because there's an interesting story there. Finally, for the unpalatable species, this is the first time that we're seeing any increases in density for any species, and the increases are extremely substantial. So for pawpaw, for example, we see an increase from 251 stems to 655. And for spicebush, they go from 430 in 1981 to 2,163, which is pretty crazy. We do again see 100% mortality in these 2 species, and they are also a little bit more opportunistic. So overall, the number of woody species present in the plot declined by 52% from 1981 to 2022, and 35% of those species were either preferred or moderately preferred by deer. We did end up going back out and looking for evidence of deer, which we did find a lot of. This is concurrent with other findings in the literature. So this study found that as deer density increased on the x-axis for 3 different sites, which are the 3 different shadings in the bar, the Shannon Diversity Index, which is a measurement of diversity, decreased. So we did find very strong evidence that aggressive white-tailed deer browse did lead to the decrease in density and diversity. So now looking at the impacts of the emerald ash borer invasion on the understory specifically. So here we predicted that these deaths would cause significant increases in canopy openness between 2000 and 2022. So what we did was we took the maps from each sampling year and we compared for mortality specifically in white ash trees. We then digitized those individual stems, as you can see in these sampling plots. And then based on their basal area, we were able to estimate the size of the individual canopy gaps. So the first 3 years, you can see that there's not a lot of canopy openness due to white ash trees, but in 2022, we see really extreme changes. So again, I wanted to point out there's only 6 to 7 years between the first 2 figures that we have here, the first 2 maps, and then 22 years between 2000 and 2022. So then we scaled what we had here in terms of the area to the amount of area produced per sampling year. So we normalized it a little bit. And between 2000 and 2022, we still do see those significant changes or substantial changes in canopy openness. This is a management concern because the emerald ash borer introduction could lead to an invasional meltdown. This is when one invasive species directly facilitates or promotes the invasion of another species. What we're seeing in this study that was actually also done in Hueston Woods is that as ash species declines due to the emerald ash borer, the growth in Lonicera macchii, which is invasive honeysuckle, increases. And then they took this study a step further, and they found that as invasive honeysuckle increases in size, native tree seedling richness decreases. Like I said, this is a concern because in 2022, honeysuckle was recorded in the plot for the first time. They do a really good job of managing it in the preserve in comparison to the outside area. There's really not that much, but they do manage it with an herbicide. Something else to keep in mind is that white-tailed deer are known to spread viable seeds via consumption and defecation, which is concerning. So we did find strong evidence that there was substantial increases in canopy openness between the last 2 sampling years. So now, because nothing in a forest is interacting on its own, I'm going to put these 2 different anthropogenic stressors together because all ecosystems are in a state of response to multiple interacting ecosystem drivers. So here I have this table where we have 41 years of understory change from 1981 to 2022 in both basal area and in density. This is for understory residents, so the species that aren't able to get big enough ever to get into the overstory. And I want to point this out because, as you remember from before, we had really substantial increases in both spicebush and pawpaw. As you can see by the p-values here, they're extremely significant. So effects that this might have on the forest, or what could be happening here: increased canopy space due to the emerald ash borer, Maigret spicebush, and enhanced ability to deter white-tailed deer herbivory. So in this study, they looked at total phenolics that are known to deter deer herbivory in spicebush leaves that are in sun environments versus in shade environments. And they did find that the phenolics were statistically or significantly higher in sun environments than they were in shaded environments. So these phenolics are known to limit herbivore consumption by lowering palatability and interfering with digestive enzymes in the gut. So if you remember all of that sun from the emerald ash borer canopy openness, it's just continuing to facilitate this response. So now looking at pawpaw specifically, so the finding that we had where they're increasing significantly in both density and basal area. Other people have found this as well. In one study, they recorded a 724% increase in just 4 decades. This may be because of the increased resource availability. And something else to keep in mind from this study is that not our study, different study, native seedling density was found to be 63% lower beneath pawpaw trees than away from pawpaw trees. So they inhibit that native tree seedling regeneration. So I've talked a lot about the understory. So now I want to put these 2 anthropogenic stressors within the context of the overstory. So we do see 100% ash mortality, as indicated here. There was 26 individuals and we're down to 0 in 2022. This could have caused an increase in basal area of sugar maple, tulip poplar, and black cherry trees. So that is the gray bar that is going up because these trees grow quickly to dominate that open canopy space. We also saw a decrease in beech basal area. There was one study that showed that beech trees are not able to compete as heavily with sugar maple trees. There's a decrease in sugar maple density. There are a lot of stems, and the weaker stems probably couldn't survive and died out. And there was an increase in tulip poplar and black cherry density as they are incredibly fast growers in the understory and were probably recruited into the overstory size class. So if you guys remember this from the understory, these changes that we're seeing in American beech and black cherry trees, I said I would come back to this, and now I am. I wanted to pull these figures back up, and here I'm just highlighting black cherry trees. So for the first 4 sampling years, you can see that their importance is relatively stable. It starts to increase slightly in 2000 and then jumps in 2022. And now looking at black cherry trees for the understory, you can see they do have that fluctuation, but a decrease starting to happen in 2000 and then an extreme drop in 2022. So what we're probably seeing here is a pulse in the system where trees in the understory are being recruited into the overstory. So now looking at American beech trees, they do remain relatively stable over the first 4 years. They drop slightly in 2022. But in the understory, we see that in 2000, they start to increase and then they jump again in 2022. So the rise of black cherry and American beech, there are some explanations for this. They are intermediate on the scale of palatable to unpalatable to deer, so they can survive eras of intense browsing in the understory and be recruited into the overstory. American beech trees do have slower growth in canopy gaps in comparison to the dominant tree, sugar maple. And this presumably caused a decline in recruitment to the overstory after the emerald ash borer because of that gap space, but an increase in the understory with the counterbalancing of the resistance to deer browse. And it is important to note that these impacts do have the ability to affect the composition of the future overstory. This is also something that was found in the literature. So as deer density increases on the x-axis here, in all three of these different plots with different treatments, the percent of plots dominated by black cherry increases. There are some future impacts that are possible for increased American beech dominance. This includes the spread of the beech bark disease, which is an invasive species that has been spreading southwest from Maine since its introduction in 1890. This is composed of both a fungal and an insect component. It induces widespread mortality in beech trees, and it indirectly affects wildlife by limiting the number of beech nuts that can be produced by the trees. So in this study, the heavy black line represents healthy beech trees, and the dotted line represents infected beech trees. You can see that there's a significantly lower amount of beech nuts produced in the infected beech trees. So some potential future impacts of black cherry dominance. They do have allelopathic tendencies, and these trees are actually invasive in Europe. And so one study found that the germination capacity of plants underneath these trees was significantly lower than away from these trees. So finally, for some conclusions, these old growth forests were once thought to be stable enough to resist invasion and diffuse anthropogenic disturbances, but the side effects of the Anthropocene may have proven these theories to be false. And the combination of white-tailed deer overbrowse and emerald ash borer-induced white ash deaths have weakened the foundation of a millennia-old system. So I'm finally going to put all the conclusions onto one slide. What you need to know is that a solid white line is a finding from this study that we did, and a dotted line is a future prediction based on relevant literature. So we found that overpopulated deer led to a decrease in stand density and a decrease in woody species biodiversity. This could have cascading declines on diversity across several taxon. Species that were not preferred by deer were left behind in great abundance relative to previous sampling years. So this includes understory residence pawpaw, which decreases native seedling density, as well as spicebush. And spicebush is known to harness secondary metabolites that resist browse, and this is a phenomenon that is further perpetuated by the open canopy gap space. Sugar maple and tulip poplar were historically dominant players in the overstory, but they decreased in the understory due to deer browse. However, they do well in highlight environments, so they increased in overstory importance, and this trend suggests that the overstory will experience decreases in sugar maple and tulip poplar in the future. Black cherry and American beech importance increased in the understory because they're intermediate on the scale of palatable to unpalatable to deer. And they're fast growers in light spaces, so they were then recruited abundantly into the overstory. This has some potential future implications, including the threat of the beech bark disease and a potential decrease in native plant germination due to black cherry's allelopathic tendencies. Oops. And the canopy gap space may be leading to an invasional meltdown where there's the promotion of honeysuckle invasion. This is known to decrease native seedling richness, and we know that it's further spread by white-tailed deer. So finally, sustained overbrowse by white-tailed deer in the understory may redirect succession to shift future overstory composition. Changes in the overstory composition may have negative impacts on biodiversity across several taxon, as well as stand regeneration and rotation. A decrease in overall stand density has implications for biodiversity due to the decrease in the structurally diverse units that we talked about earlier in the presentation. And the emerald ash borer may have triggered an invasional meltdown. So some conservation and management implications. They do so much out there in that preserve. We saw them all the time, which is really, really awesome to see. But we could increase the frequency of controlled hunts within the preserve. Consider the temporary implementation of deer exclusion fences and guards to protect those seedlings that we know are susceptible and to give them a chance to reach into the overstory. Split conservation efforts more evenly between the monitoring and protecting of rare and endangered species and the herbicidal management of invasive species. Research how to successfully reintroduce native species no longer present within the research plot. This is the idea of holding the niche space to then ward off the invasion from coming back. And finally, at the landscape scale, manage for old growth characteristics over larger scale plots to promote stand regeneration and biodiversity. So this is the last thing that I have. This is the concept of the basins of attraction. And on the x-axis here, we have the ecosystem state. So here it is intact. And as you move further right, it becomes degraded. On the y-axis at the top, we have a fully functional ecosystem. And at the bottom, we have a non-functional ecosystem. And each ball on the figure that is resting in a divot represents an ecosystem. And that divot represents a stable state. So if the ball is in that divot, it is stable. If the ball moves down, as indicated by the dotted arrows, it's becoming degraded. And if it's moving up, it's being restored. So what I think we had in 1981 and 1988 was a fully functional and diverse forest. By 1994 and 2000, we had lost a substantial amount of density and diversity. And unfortunately, by 2022, there was a lot of species that we lost. And it's going to take a lot of restoration efforts to push this ecosystem back up into the state that it was before. So all of the data that we have is publicly available on eCommons. If anybody wants to go check it out. And with that, I have a lot of people to thank. First, Dr. McEwen for being my research advisor and mentor for 5 years, which is wild, for introducing me to research and the joys and wonderment of trees. Dr. Van Kat for letting us use his data and continue his project, and for just all the context that he's given us the past 2 years. To Kate Lloyd for all of her great ideas and patience and just like her wonderful science brain. To Michaela Woods for being my first undergraduate research advisor, mentor in the lab. And she's just really influenced the way that I think about ecology and forest dynamics and people as well, which I think is a good thing. Dr. Prather and Dr. Hellman, who have really supported me and given me a lot of feedback in terms of thinking about my project in the broader scope of ecological theory. The McEwen Lab and the summer team, which I couldn't have done this without them. It's been a lot of fun. And then Hueston Woods State Park, the University of Dayton Department of Biology, Eric Sagasser for working with us all the time and allowing us to use the land. And finally, to the forest. Can't not thank the forest. And to you guys for listening.
Time now for questions from anyone. For those heat maps that you created using all those individual points, did you create those in GIS using tools, or was created outside here? Yeah, so I just found out that you can actually make them in R as well if you wanted to. But at the time I was taking GIS classes, and you just have all the individual points, and there is a tool that you input those points into, and it basically just generates a continuous surface. But you have to choose exactly what you're looking for, like put in the parameters, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's what it looked like. I was just curious if you'd use it already or not. Yeah, cool. I've tried. Nice job. Thank you.
Grace, great body of work and level presentation.
Thank you.
Question for you. One of your stressors. So the Emerald Ash Borer has come through. We've lost a lot, not all the ash in certain areas.
Right.
When did the ash come back? Because basically they've destroyed their food source.
They really have. There's a couple things that I have to say in response to that. So ash trees first, they have this corky bark on the outside of them. that they develop as they get older. And that's where the beetle lays its eggs. And once it lays its eggs in there, then the larvae hatches and it bores into the tree. So we do have ash trees that are younger, and they're just not old enough for the ash borer to eat them, basically. So I don't know if the ash borer will ever go away because we're slowly going to have those small ash trees being regenerated. Eventually, once the big ones die out, maybe. Another fear is that ash trees are in the olive family, I believe. So they could have an additional host that's just not specifically preferred by them yet. So they may switch over. Be a problem.
Still be a resident.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Really drift off, Chris, excuse me.
Thank you.
That ecological energy, the Remington trademark, just to understand, is that the energy of succession, like a potential energy that
Yeah.
you just kind of pull? So once you hit climax, is there no ecological energy in the system? And that sounds bad offhand, but
Yeah,
can you talk for a minute?
sure. There's still ecological energy in the system, definitely. And that's the idea of these disturbances promoting that energy and promoting that regeneration. Because as the disturbances remove biomass from the system, then there's new resource availability, there's new light, and then that reproduction, growth, and that competition starts to happen again, which is that ecological energy. So it's this interesting, like, balancing effect.
Perfectly understand. Thank you.
Yes.
Really great talk, and I had a lot of questions, and you literally answered them all for now.
Oh, good.
Great, I hope so. But one thing that I thought of, when you're talking about beach bark disease, is that there's a new beach leaf disease or something
Ooh. Yeah.
there. And so I was wondering if you had maybe seen that at all. I know, I'm pretty sure it started in like northern Ohio, because I remember seeing it back
Interesting.
there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've seen it. We've seen some funky insects on beech trees. I don't remember what they're called. Do you remember what they're called?
They're an aphid.
Yeah, there's an aphid. I didn't notice the beech leaf disease though. So I guess that's a good thing, but also I wasn't looking for it specifically. So
Yeah, that's true.
did anyone else see it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Cool. Any other
Okay.
questions?
If there's nothing else, just thank Grace one more time. I would say that Grace has a full-time position at the University of Kentucky as a ecological researcher, starting pretty soon this spring, and so more journey for her ahead. But at this point, we'll ask for everyone to depart the room for the portion, and then we're gonna have the, let's see, it's 1:15, so sometime maybe 1:45 or 2, there'll be a gathering here in the fifth floor, it's right outside. So you're invited to that.
Dr. Davis, here.
See ya.
And that's it.